Great, so warm welcome everyone to today's session. Thank you for being with us. This is organised under the Collaboration for Healthier Lives Coalition of Action at the CGF. And today's webinar is all about looking at behavioural insights, behaviour change, and how we can all work together to help people to live healthier lives. So designing with the grain of human behaviour, nudging healthier choices. I know many of you on today's webinar, and many of you are new. So it really is, I think, a global community of people who have this passion to try and help people live healthier lives. So I hope that you find some takeaways from today's session. Don't hesitate to pose any questions as we go forward. And just before we get into the details of the session, if we can just look at the antitrust caution statement that we respect, of course, across all CGF meetings, virtual or physical. So please just take a moment to read that before we get into the details of today's webinar. Great. So we would love to have lots of questions, feedback from all of you. So there are a number of different ways that you can do that. There will be a listening part of today's webinar where you'll be able to ask questions directly here at the chat box on the right hand side of your screen. You should be able to see a chat box. I see there's already some questions there. I'll get back to you. So please do keep them coming in. I'll track that as we go through today's webinar, or you can send me directly an email, and if we don't have time to get to your question, I will promise that I will follow up with you after today's session, or if we do have time during the session. So I am really honoured to be surrounded by experts and could not do this job without working with the brilliant minds that we have on today's call. So we've Hannah, Filippo, Susan and Pierre, all of whom have worked with us and supported us at the Consumer Goods Forum to help us help people to live healthier lives, and have brought their expertise through all of their work, either through the CGF or beyond, and I have absolutely learned from all of them. So I hope you'll have that same pleasure today to learn from this team. Again, as you're listening to the first part of today's session, think of the questions that you'd like, the questions that you'd like to bring to the panel, and we will try to make this as interactive as possible in the second half of the session. So just quickly, if you're brand new to this and you've never heard what Collaboration for Healthier Lives is, it's a coalition of action at the Consumer Goods Forum, so 400 members in 70 countries. It's a movement of companies who really wanted to create impact on the ground. Here you can see our framework is around driving healthier lives with our own people. So what are we doing with our employees? How can we do that in the stores, because CGF is made up of retailers and manufacturers, and how we can do that in a digital ecosystem. We have two very clear goals across 14 countries, now 14 countries. The latest chapter to join the movement is Russia. So trying to raise awareness on healthier lives, what does that mean, and helping people to really reach that goal, and then trying to see how does that progress translate into the basket. What are we actually doing through the hypothesis that if we change consumption, we're actually helping you to reach that goal of living a healthier life. So all of that, of course, through numerous commitments, accountability, showing progress is something that's really important to us. And that's a huge and critical role that Pierre and Susan are working with us to help us understand, are we making progress into the basket? So with that, I'll hand you over to the Behavioural Insights team that I'm sure you have all heard of. They're renowned around the world for their expertise. We will share the slides with you afterwards, and the session is being recorded. So for any of your colleagues who can't join, they'll be able to catch up at a later date. And so I'll hand you now over to the team, Hannah and Filippo from the Behavioural Insights team, as we kick off today's session. So Hannah, I believe it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Sharon. It's lovely to be here, and really an honour and a pleasure to be on this panel alongside Susan and Pierre as well. So thank you very much for inviting us to speak at this webinar today on how to apply insights from behavioural science to promote healthier diets. This is, I think, a really exciting opportunity both to recap and celebrate some of the progress that has already been made in this space, but we also hope that we can inspire some more action and really set the ambition for the future on this agenda. So to start off, I really wanted to sort of outline what we'll be doing, and I think we'll try and spend just the next 30 minutes presenting before opening up to a wider discussion with Professor Susan Jebb and Pierre Chandon, and of course the many industry partners that are present today. Our outline for today is, first of all, we'll start by briefly really just introducing the Behavioural Insights team to give you some background about who Filippo and I are, what we do, and why we care about promoting healthy and sustainable diets. We'll then talk about dual process models briefly, and these are some of the most important models of human behaviour in behavioural sciences, and I think they provide a really helpful lens through which to understand the factors that drive our food choices. And then finally, we will use our EAST framework, which is a toolbox which was developed by the Behavioural Insights team, to summarise some of the most promising behavioural strategies that you can use to promote healthy food choices. And as part of that, we'll draw quite heavily, I think, in some cases, on studies and projects that have been conducted by the Collaboration for Healthier Lives. So, first, just to provide some really quick background about the Behavioural Insights team, we started off life in the UK Cabinet Office around 10 years ago. And then in 2014, we spun out of government and we now operate as a social purpose company across the world. This means we essentially work like a consulting firm, but with a twist, in that we only take on projects that we believe will deliver positive social impact. Our mission then, as it is now, is the same. And this is to apply insights from behavioural sciences to help design more effective policies and interventions to improve people's lives. Now, because our mission is all about promoting positive social impact, it's maybe not surprising that we have a strong focus on how to apply behavioural insights to promote healthier diets. And I'm sure the figures that we've put up here on screen will be familiar to many of you on this call, but I think it can be useful to just quickly remind ourselves of really the devastating scale of this issue. So worldwide obesity has nearly tripled since 1975, and globally around 40% of adults are overweight or obese, and in many countries like in the UK, this actually affects a large majority of adults. And poor diets continue to exacerbate health inequities. So as people who live in more deprived areas are much more likely to suffer from conditions related to unhealthy diets. And finally, when we think of things like the Global Burden of Disease study, you know, the data tells us here that unhealthy diets are actually the second biggest cause of death worldwide. In the UK, they cause more than 100,000 deaths per year. So we've outlined that this is a really significant problem, but I think the good news in a way is that there are things that we can do about it. And it's really important to highlight that actually this presents a unique opportunity, especially for retailers and decision makers within the food industry, to have a really positive impact on people's health and well-being at scale. So retailers, for example, can have a really powerful influence on what food people eat, with a very large proportion of people's food budget being spent in these stores. And strong scientific evidence suggests that interventions in these food environments can really help people make healthier food choices. So we've talked about the scale of the problem and how the food industry and retail can help. But how does behavioural science come into this? And how can behavioural science help us to make the most out of this opportunity? So this slide here really shows the process that we think often underpins the development of interventions to promote healthy choices in food. And it often starts with the general public and people who generally want to be healthy and make healthier choices, but they don't like to be forced or made to feel guilty about the food that they consume. So then a common reaction from decision makers to this attitude is to focus on developing interventions that provide things like factual information about what constitutes a healthy diet. And the underlying assumption here is that once people know what foods are healthy and what foods are not, they'll naturally gravitate towards making healthier choices. And I think this is where behavioural sciences have made their biggest contribution, because research from behavioural sciences has consistently shown that providing information is important, but it's usually not enough on its own to promote meaningful and sustained behaviour change. So why is that the case? And this is where we sort of bring in this model, the dual process model. So according to dual process models in behavioural sciences, there are two systems that drive human behaviour. The first is the reflective system, the system that is all about our rational and analytical processes. For example, if we're trying to choose what we have for lunch, and if we were to carefully stop and think about all the pros and cons of the different food options available to us, then we'd be using our reflective system to choose our lunch. But actually, using this system is quite effortful, and it requires a lot of our cognitive resources. So in general, we tend to overestimate the number of choices and behaviours that are driven by that reflective system. And we tend to believe that most of our choices are a result of careful and conscious considerations and the pros and cons. But actually, that's not the case. Much of our behaviours are driven by our automatic system, so our automatic reactions to external cues from the physical and social environments in which we live. And I think this slide can really nicely help to visualise this idea. So if you look at the orange line, that line shows the processes of the reflective system of somebody who intends to eat healthily. For example, over the course of the day, someone might have higher or lower reflective motivation and willpower to eat healthily. So that might dip, for example, when we're hungry before lunch, or when we're tired or stressed, and we have less willpower to put into our decisions. But our food choices aren't the exclusive result of these reflective processes. So all of our food choices will take place in specific environments, which can either support our intention to eat healthily or make it really difficult. And that's shown by the blue axis on the right-hand side of the screen. And this blue line, they could similarly change throughout the day depending on the external environment that we find ourselves in at a particular time. So if we live in environments that promote unhealthy food choices, then our automatic reactions to these environments will sometimes lead us to make unhealthy choices, despite our conscious intentions and our willpower to try to eat healthily. So, for example, here, this might be an unplanned sugary drink that's part of a meal deal at lunchtime, or an unhealthy snack in the evening when you're shopping for dinner, but you get tempted by the chocolates that you see on your way to the checkout. So behavioural sciences have shown that you can target people's reflective system, and that this is important. So in our graph here, that means you could implement interventions to shift this orange line upwards. So for example, you can provide information about what is healthy and what isn't, and you can help people to stay motivated, and you can try to boost their willpower. And these interventions are useful, but they usually only achieve small effect sizes that are not sustained in the long term. And that's probably because these interventions only consider our reflective system, but not our automatic reactions to the environments in which we live. So really developing interventions that also aim to restructure these environments to make sure that they support healthy food choices, so interventions that shift the blue line downwards, can really be a more promising way of changing people's behaviour. Because focusing only on people's motivation, their knowledge and willpower will not be enough to change the tide on obesity and healthy eating. And we really need to think about how to restructure the environments in which we buy and eat foods to make the healthy choice the easy choice. And my colleague Filippo will now outline some tactics for how we can do this in practice.
Thanks very much, Hannah. Now, to translate some of these general behavioral science principles into concrete and implementable interventions, the Behavioural Insights team has developed a framework known as the EAST framework, which summarizes some of the most promising techniques that we can use to promote healthier food choices. So at the very high level, the EAST framework suggests that if you want to promote a healthy food choice, you need to make this choice easy, attractive, social, and timely. And in the next couple of slides, I will present some specific behavioral techniques within each of these 4 domains, and also provide some case studies for how these interventions have been implemented in practice. Now, I'd just like to say that many of the case studies we will present today involved a huge amount of work from many of the industry partners present today, and also from the University of Oxford, who evaluated these interventions. So we just want to give them the credit for doing this great work. So, as mentioned before, the first thing that you can do to encourage healthy food choices is to make them easy. And this is because people often tend to make the choice that requires the least effort from them. So I think we all have had the experience of having to choose between the elevator and a staircase. And despite knowing consciously that taking the stairs will probably be better for our health in the long term, Most people will go for the elevator simply because it is the option that requires the least effort from us, and it is the easy choice. And so there are a number of different techniques that we can use to encourage healthy food choices by making them easy. Setting healthy defaults is one of the most promising techniques in this area. People often stick with the choice that was pre-selected for them, rather than going through the hassle of changing it. And this obviously generates an opportunity for us to promote the healthy food choice by pre-selecting it for people. For example, there is good evidence to suggest that defaults work really well in school settings. And studies have shown that when parents are asked to select the school meal for their kids, the proportion of parents selecting the healthiest option increases really quite substantively when this option is pre-selected as the default. Another really promising technique to make the healthy option the easiest option is to make this healthy option more visible and more prominent at point of purchase. And this seems to work really well both when implemented in physical stores, but also when implemented in online supermarkets. So when we pull together all the evidence that exists about the impact of this type of intervention, we find that making healthy food products more prominent at point of purchase, while making less healthy products less prominent, can reduce energy intake of intervention recipients by up to 19%. And a final example of how to make the healthy choice the easy choice is to increase the relative availability of healthy options in stores. Now, this can be achieved in a number of different ways. For example, we can reformulate the foods that are available to people in stores. We can add a line of healthier foods to the existing range, or we can remove unhealthy options from the stores. And based on the current scientific evidence, this intervention can lead to up to 17% reductions in the energy consumed by recipients. And a project by McCain, Tesco, and the Oxford University put this to test and used this strategy to promote the sale of healthier frozen chips. What they did with their intervention was simply to add a line of light chips to the existing range of regular chips in 35 Tesco Express stores here in London. And what they found was that simply introducing the new range of healthier alternative chips led to a 19 percentage point reduction in the sales of regular chips. So there's obviously a question here around the economic viability of this technique, but there is some evidence from the Oxford evaluation to suggest that the reduction in the sales of regular chips was compensated by a similar uplift in the sale of light chips. And this suggests that people were not purchasing fewer products overall, but simply swapping regular chips for the healthier alternative. Now, assuming that this was the case, so that the intervention promoted a swap between the regular product and the healthier version of it, this intervention would have led to a quite significant reduction in the energy content and in the saturated fatty acid content of customers' shopping baskets. So very promising early evidence of this intervention. The second approach to promote healthy food choices from the East framework is to make them attractive. And there is a very large number of promising techniques in this space. So the most obvious one perhaps is around advertisement. And this includes both focusing advertisements on the healthy and most sustainable food products, such as, for example, the significant push in advertising we've seen on sustainable meat alternatives in recent years. But importantly, or perhaps even more importantly, it involves focusing on reducing advertising on unhealthy options. And there is some modeling work to suggest that this measure would lead to some significant improvement in health and health gains nationally. Another important strategy is to try and align the economic incentives with the health agenda. And the classic example here is the sugar levy. So in 2016, the government announced a tax on sugar in soft drinks. And this announcement was followed by a 44% reduction in the total sugar content of soft drinks. And the total volume of sugar sold from soft drinks decreased by 35%, despite a 15% increase in the sales of soft drinks. So this really highlights how the sugar levy did not reduce consumption of sugar purely by changing and influencing customer choices, but also by encouraging manufacturers to reformulate some of their products. And a final important tool to consider to make healthy food choices attractive is to use price promotions on healthy items, and again, importantly, to restrict price promotions on unhealthy items. So this is a paper that I've published together with some former colleagues at Oxford, where we looked at all the existing evidence on the effectiveness of interventions to change food purchasing behaviours in supermarkets. And what the evidence told us was that the interventions involving price promotions or changing the price of products had by far the greatest likelihood of significantly promoting healthy food choices. And again, this strategy was used in one of the projects of the Collaboration for Healthier Lives. And Sainsbury's developed an intervention that combined price promotions on healthier food products with a Disney hero-themed campaign on these same products. And the Oxford University evaluation suggested that compared to the previous year, the introduction of this intervention was linked with a very large and significant increase in the sale of the targeted healthier options. So for example, they found almost a 400% increase in the promoted food products and a 70% increase in lower sugar beans. So that said, the intervention and the evaluation of this intervention also showed that these effects disappeared after the removal of the intervention. And this really raises the wider question of how we can promote longer term changes in people's behavior. Now, the evidence in this space is much weaker, partly because it's obviously harder to conduct long-term evaluations. But in general, this is likely to require a combination of more intense interventions initially to break customers' unhealthy habits to start with, and then the continued long-term implementation of lighter touch interventions that do not require active engagements from recipients and that are also feasible to be implemented on a sustained basis. So the next intervention technique I'd like to cover is about making healthy food choices and sustainable food choices feel social. So I think as humans, we like or tend to think of ourselves as completely independent and self-determined beings. But the reality is that many of our behaviors, and particularly routine and habitual behaviors, are strongly influenced by what other people and what other peers do. So highlighting that most other people already perform the desired behavior, for example, consuming enough fruit and vegetable, can be a really effective way to motivate behavior change. Now, at the Behavioural Insights team, we effectively use this technique to promote a very wide range of health behaviours, including reducing unnecessary prescriptions of antibiotics or increasing referrals to cancer screening. But using social norm messages to promote healthy food choices can be quite tricky. So the first question we need to ask ourselves before using social norm interventions is whether the current norm is in line with the behaviour that we want to promote. For example, let's imagine we want to promote the selection of the smallest dessert portion size in a cafe. The first thing we need to check is whether most customers already go for the small portion size. If they do, that's great. We can use what we call descriptive static social norms, which is something like putting up a banner or a flyer saying, did you know that 80% of people like you selected the smallest portion of this cake? Now, a common problem of using social norms to promote healthy eating is that in a country where 60% of adults are overweight or obese, more often than not, current norms are not in line with the desired behaviors that we want to promote. So most people do not select small portion sizes, most people do not eat enough fruit and vegetables, and most people do not stay within the recommended levels of red and processed meat consumption. So how can we effectively use social norms without being deceptive? One thing we can do to overcome this challenge could be to use dynamic social norms. And these are essentially norms that can be used where most people are not yet performing the desired behavior, but the social norm is slowly changing over time to become more and more in line with the behavior that we want to promote. And a perfect example here would be meat consumption. So we know that less than 5% of people in the UK follow a vegetarian diet, but there is also a noticeable increase in the number of people trying to cut down. And so a recent study by Sparkman used dynamic norms to reduce meat consumption in cafeterias. They randomly selected some cafeteria customers to receive a neutral leaflet, while other customers were randomly selected to receive a leaflet outlining this dynamic norm of people's attempt to reduce their meat consumption. So they read something along the lines of, do you know that 30% of people have started to reduce their meat consumption in recent years? And simply highlighting this changing social norm significantly increased the number of people who ended up selecting the plant-based meal despite the overall prevalence of people selecting plant-based options still being in the minority. Now, sometimes it can also be difficult to use dynamic social norms. For example, portion sizes are neither the current norm nor they're a occurring norm. So portion sizes are becoming larger and larger rather than smaller and smaller over time. So as the last option, what we can do is to use injunctive or liking social norms, which essentially means that we highlight how most people approve, support, or enjoy performing the desired behavior. For example, you could highlight that most people enjoy consuming 5 portions a day of fruit and vegetables. And again, there is some early evidence to suggest that this can also be a promising way of using social norms to motivate most small changes in people's food choices. Now, coming to the end of the EASE framework, the last set of techniques to maximize the chances of your interventions being effective at promoting healthy food choices is to consider their timeliness. So, for example, we know that people are much more strongly influenced by the immediate outcomes of their behavior compared to the future outcomes of their behavior, which is a phenomenon that we call future discounting in behavioral sciences. So if you want to encourage a behavior, you might want to highlight the immediate consequences of this behavior rather than only focusing on the long-term ones. And here's a good case study from DrinkAware. Instead of only highlighting the health conditions that somebody might develop from consuming too much alcohol in 20, 30, or 40 years' time, they draw attention to the number of calories that people can save then and there if they avoid drinking. So this is the immediate consequence compared to only focusing on the long-term conditions. Second thing is that it's really important to deliver the interventions just about when people are making their dietary choice. And in the context of information provision, putting health labels right on the product packages is a good example of how to deliver information in a timely way. So exactly when people need to inform their food purchases. And finally, offering point of selection swaps can be another way of intervening in a timely way to promote healthy food choices. And this is particularly applicable to online environments. So you can envisage an interventions where if somebody selects a food that for which a healthy alternative exists, a pop-up window encourages them to switch to the healthy alternative. And there is only early evidence on the effectiveness of this intervention technique, but the existing studies seem to show some promise both in terms of the acceptability as well as in terms of the effectiveness of this approach. For example, a recent study in a virtual online supermarket found that offering swaps of products with lower content of saturated fats reduced the amount of saturated fats in participants' shopping baskets, crucially without increasing the costs, the energy, the sugar, or the salt content in their overall baskets. So this is all I wanted to say on the EASE framework. I obviously outline a very high number of intervention tactics to promote healthier food choices. And so I really think it's important now to make the point that the expected effect sizes and effectiveness of these different approaches varies greatly. And the Nuffield ladder of interventions is a very easy and clear way to get some initial sense of which of these interventions are likely to deliver the greatest impact. Starting with information provision, as said before, this type of interventions are likely to only deliver small effect sizes, followed by interventions enabling healthy food choices and nudges, such as, for example, point of purchase labels, swaps, or healthy defaults. Then we have financial interventions that we know to be among the most promising approaches to promote healthy eating, such as incentives, disincentives, but also taxes and price promotions. And finally, the highest tier of interventions when it comes to effectiveness is restricting or eliminating unhealthy choices. Now, in practice, this might involve reformulating your available foods, changing portion sizes, reducing the availability of unhealthy products in stores. Unfortunately, the ease of implementation is almost exactly the inverse of this chart of effectiveness. So the interventions that are really easy to implement tend to also be the ones that achieve the smaller effect sizes. And so the point I want to make here is that while it is good to leverage the impact of the low-hanging fruit, so the interventions that are easy to implement but only achieve modest effect sizes like information provision and labeling, if we really want to make a change to obesity and change the tide on unhealthy eating, it's really necessary to also consider some of the higher tier interventions as well. So I'll stop here with just a final slide to say that it's great to see so many industry partners joining the collaboration for healthier lives and making positive steps in the right direction to promote healthier and also more sustainable diets. And I think during the panel discussion, it would be great to hear from some of these industry partners about their ambition for the future. Now, at BIT, we have identified 3 areas where we would really love to see more work going forward. The first ambition perhaps could be around moving from implementing and evaluating individual interventions to designing healthier overall food environments. So instead of focusing on a single tactic, we can really think about how we can combine all of the tactics that we have presented today. So reformulation, portion sizes, promotions, positioning and labeling, to really develop an environment where the healthy choice is the easy choice. The second ambition could relate to generate more insights on what works long-term. So we have seen that some interventions are very effective short-term, but do not lead to sustained behavior change. So it would be great to have an ambition for the future to generate more evidence on what tactics might work and might shift food choices in a sustained way. And the third ambition could be to start scaling up some of the interventions that we have found to be effective. And this could both involve rolling out some of these interventions geographically, so across the UK and beyond as well. But it could also involve rolling out some of the interventions that we have tested on a specific food category to the wider range of foods that are available in stores. So moving from increasing the availability of healthy chips to increasing the availability of all healthy foods and reducing the availability of unhealthy foods across all food groups. So I'll stop here and leave the stage to Professor Susan Jebb and Professor Pierre Chandon for the panel discussion. Thank you.
Super, thank you so much, Hannah and Filippo, for sharing all that information. And for those of you who are asking me, we will share out a recap with all of you. So we do have Professor Susan Jebb and Professor Pierre Chandon who are with us on the webinar today. Susan is here, we just can't see her, but she is here. So both professors have worked with us on that importance, exactly like Filippo stated at the end, doing all of this. And many of you listening are thinking probably, we're doing this, but is it having any impact? Are we really helping people on the ground in those environments that we mentioned, in store, digital, and with our own employees? Are we moving the needle? Are we having impact? And so both Pierre and Susan have the experience of helping us to understand the effectiveness of our evaluations. And Susan, I'd love to start with you on, to give us some feedback on your experience. You've worked with us in Collaboration for Healthier Lives in the UK. If you did have feedback on your experience and maybe your hopes, your ambition from all of the retailers and manufacturers that are listening to us, whether it's in the UK or around the world, that you'd like to share with them on learnings or things that we could do better in the next phase of our ambition. So Susan, over to you.
Thank you, Sharon, and hello, everyone. So it's been great actually working with CGF over the last couple of years. Not always easy, but in the end, it's I think we've achieved a lot. There's been a great sense of wanting to do things, and some companies, some of the retailers in particular, have really done lots and lots and lots of things, and that's great and fantastic energy. But when it comes to evaluation, actually, it can become really difficult to know what's going on when you've got 600 things all happening at the same time for 5 minutes each. I, slightly characterize that, but you know what I mean. So what I think the first thing to say is that let's sit down, think hard about what to do, and then deliver interventions which are done in a very meaningful way. So we pick our best bets, and that means some of the things that we think from the evidence base might be most effective and that are also genuinely going to be doable. And then we roll them out, with real gusto at scale. So at scale, plenty of stores, but also over a sustained period of time, because turning interventions on and off and on and off and on and off makes it really, really difficult to work out what's going on and to separate that from just you know, weekly or seasonal fluctuations. So I think that we've done some evaluations, companies themselves have done their own, and so I think we should be now trying to hone in on what works best. And Filippo's given a really good steer based on some of the CGF data, but also the wider literature about which interventions might be most effective. I think our perspective on which ones to pick would be that, well, I think availability, it's, well, two, positioning, really important. The trials we've done taking some of the high fat, high sugar items out of prominent locations, things like the end of aisle, has really made a big difference to reducing sales of those products. That's great for public health. I can see that that's challenging for business. So we need to find some way of making that a win-win. Otherwise, it's never going to stick. The second one, which I think has the potential to be good all round, is this issue of availability. And the trial that Filippo mentioned about the lighter chips, I think was a real success. Success for public health, a success for business, because people swapped to the healthier option and so sales were maintained. There's plenty of scope to do that in many other product ranges, whether that's breakfast cereals, whether it's you know, biscuits, for example, biscuits and cakes, savoury snacks. So I think that availability is looking very promising, not just from the in-store trials, but some of the experimental work we've been doing. Availability is coming out as a sort of rather underused but potentially very effective option. Simply shifting the proportion seems to change people's choices, probably for a whole variety of reasons. Partly it signals that these must be very popular because the supermarket stocks a lot of them. So you're actually implying a social norm as well as just changing the default, because actually there's more space dedicated to the lower variety. So I would strongly encourage people to look at that. Promotions, you know, overt promotions essentially are acting through price, and you all know better than I do that price is a huge impact on choice. The problem we've seen over the last year or so is that companies struggle to maintain those promotions over time, and once you remove the effect disappears. So I think unless we can find a way of building some stronger sustainability into that, I'm not sure that's where I'd put my best bet. So those would be my pointers: availability and placement within store. I'd strongly urge we need to scale up, so targeting bigger effects, scale out by involving more stores, and I guess scale onwards, trying to keep my narrative going, meaning let's do things which will have some, which we can sustain over time. I think those are very, very important. And my final thing I would say is we have evaluated a tiny proportion of all the interventions that have happened. And that means our learning is much less than it could have been. The big roadblock in that has been data availability and trying to organise data sharing agreements. What I would strongly say to all of you is that if you believe evaluation matters, if you think it's helpful for you as a company to learn what you're doing, if you believe it matters to the credibility externally for other people to see and trust in what you're doing, you have got to commit to data sharing and independent evaluation. Now, what usually happens is companies say, oh yes, we'd like to do that. Well, liking isn't enough. You have got to put in place systems which will allow that to happen efficiently, because without that, we all spend a lot of time chasing each other up over it, everybody getting very frustrated, and it's just not a good use of anybody's time. So if you want to do the evaluation, build that into your planning from the outset about how that's going to happen.
Super. Thank you so much, Susan, for sharing that. And for those of you who don't know, we did evaluate, as Susan said, a part of the data that we've learned in year one. We have a bigger and bolder and more focused, I would say, ambition in year two in Collaboration for Healthier Lives in the UK. And another learning for us is really working with academics to help you design from the beginning. And that's something we'll definitely do as we work towards what year two will look like of Collaboration for Healthier Lives in the UK. So if you do have any questions for Susan, we will get to them at the end of the session. So Pierre, I'd love to move over to you. You've worked with us in France and in the US. I know that you have some learnings, the same as Susan, that you would like to share with us, either from our work together or other work that you have done. So Pierre, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you and to hear the great work that BIT and, of course, Susan Jebb at Oxford have been doing with the CGF. And I've been really happy to, just like Susan, in my collaboration with the CGF, mostly in France, a little bit in the US. And I have prepared just really roughly some recommendations based on my own experience for those of you who are listening here, because I really believe that there's an opportunity for win-win here, where we should have collaboration between researchers and companies. But really, the first point is exactly what Susan said. You know, we have to be ambitious, because we know it's very hard to move the needle. If you want to move from just one product and selling one product versus another, that's great. But if you really want to answer the tough questions of, does it really changes the nutritional quality of an overall basket of foods that's been purchased, you really have to look at it at a broad scale, and in terms of many categories, but also in terms of time, because we know that you don't want to just influence curiosity sale the first time and then no one is repeat buying. We need to look at least, I would say, 2 months, you know, to see if there's an effect that lingers on. The other principle that's very important is the issue of governance. You know, we are unfortunately in an age where no one trusts anyone or anything anymore. And as soon as, I mean, I know, for example, we have colleagues, researchers who would never even agree to be in the same room as with industry people because, you know, they think they will be tainted by the association. Unfortunately, it's not everyone believes that, but we need to be careful to have rules. And for example, the studies that we did with the CGF in France, we pre-registered everything, including how we will measure the success. And the researchers, in the end, we had a committee that had the final say over which products would be involved in the study and how it's going to be analyzed, etc. And there's, of course, the issue of funding. So we were lucky that INSEAD, my school, funded the work of an assistant on this project. But it's not something that's sustainable. In many countries, universities don't have the resources to do that. And I think a frank discussion on how we can do that, maybe a consortium model, where it's not, you know, one company funding one project, but a pool of companies funding a pool of projects, probably a good idea. And the final thing in terms of principle that's very important to keep in mind is we need to keep in mind also the end consumers, you know, the shoppers, the citizens. So for example, in the study in France, part of what we measured is how the people's evaluation of the program. Do they like it? You know, do they understand it? Do they just think it's smoke and mirrors to hide commercial purposes? And it was very interesting to do that. For example, we found out that when we asked people beforehand, we described what we're going to do, they were really enthusiastic. And then during the study, we asked them again, you know, what do you think? And they were actually a little bit disappointed. They said, you know, you could do more, which was very encouraging for us. So these are the principles, and then there's a practical aspect. Because really, like Susan said, one thing that I've learned very painfully, to be honest, is that you really need to have the involvement of key people. And I thought naively that the most important person would have to be the chief executive. In our cases, both Danone and Carrefour were really leading this project and were extremely really effective. However, I realized that the key people we needed to have on board was the chief data security officer, whatever his role is, who still to this day is not letting us have access to the data because, you know, it's now become very, very complex to share data. And so the second point is to get everyone involved from the start. If I compare what the CGF has done in France and in the US we were brought really at the end to evaluate the tons of different interventions that different companies had done. And it was really hard to find a common metric and to even find some logic, because everyone had done different things in different ways. Whereas in France, from the very beginning, we sat as a team and we co-created the interventions. We said, what do we know in the literature? Looking at things like what Anna and Filippo said, things we know already, things we don't know. And let's try to focus together on a few key interventions. And then, we will let different companies do it. So for example, one thing that came out, which was really novel, I think, is the idea of a combo deal. If you are a product that has a pretty low Nutri-Score, for example, maybe cheese, for example, by design, it's never going to have an A, but you could offer a price promotion to your buyers if they also buy vegetables, and then here's a recipe on how to create a quiche or something with your cheese and the vegetable. So these were ideas that came out from discussion between everyone, and that was actually very impactful. And one thing, for example, that I also want to emphasize is that we as scientists, we are reductionists, okay? We want to look at one intervention at a time and see if it works. And often we had the discussion that our partners wanted to fire on all cannons and do everything at once, which is of course more likely to be effective. But if the goal is to learn what works and doesn't work, it won't help us, because we won't be able to attribute the effectiveness to one aspect or the other. So there's a lot of learning going on from the beginning to decide how we're going to do this, how we're going to measure the impact, the change in nutritional quality of diets using, for example, a nutrition profiling system. And the final thing I would say is that it's been, I think, very useful to look at it from different angles. So of course, we need to have nutritional data, because it's not enough to show that you're selling product A and more or less. You have to know whether it actually is overall an improvement in the nutritional quality, which is not always super easy to get. And there are lots of debates, as we're all aware of. But we used the Oxford, now French nutrient profiling system underlying the Nutri-Score. But we also mix that, of course, with purchase data, obviously, and this is where the retailers are really key, because they're the ones who have the data, and also attitudinal data, so we get some insights from the shoppers themselves. So I will stop here. Happy to take questions and give you more details if needed.
Super, thank you so much, Pierre. So I have questions coming in by email and from the chat. So let's go to the first one that we've seen from Seamus in the chat. And if anyone wants me to unmute your volume, don't hesitate. Otherwise, I can be your vehicle to ask the question. So we touched on this a little bit. So over 50 years, the food industry is we've evolved into a commodity-driven, cost-driven profit model. How do we change that model, incorporating more healthy product lines, maybe lower volume, and perhaps reduce profitability? So that discussion, Susan mentioned it, Hannah mentioned it, Pierre, you mentioned it, finding that balance between those business indicators and driving health scores. I don't know who wants to take that one. Maybe Pierre, I'll start with you. Or Susan, actually, was something that you did mention on that you've seen from some of the work in the UK.
So, of course, businesses have got to stay profitable. That's absolutely essential. But there has to be a change in the business model. So broadly speaking, again, very general comment, is business has grown by selling more calories. And that's got to change. It's got to sell more nutrition. Now, that does not necessarily mean smaller volumes overall, but it means changing the proportion of foods that are purchased. Now, for companies that have got a very diverse portfolio, that's obviously easier than it is for some companies who are in a smaller space. If you're a confectionery business, maybe not so many healthier places to go. But nonetheless, one can still focus on the sort of quality over quantity approach by trying so that we are that you can maintain profits, but without encouraging people to overconsume. So I'm not pretending it's easy, but I think there are ways that most businesses can continue to be profitable. While people still need to eat, and it's just encouraging people to eat a little bit differently. I think that there are some issues which are particularly challenging. Things like having impulse foods on the end of an aisle, we know leads to uplifts in sales, and that's where there may need to be a need for mandation. And I've said this previously, if we want to create a level playing field in some areas, that might need to happen. But I think that the experience that's accumulated from CGF would be exactly the kind of evidence that would help to inform sensible, appropriate and proportionate regulation in this space. So I don't rule out that may be necessary, but I think there's actually a lot that can be done without that.
If I may just reinforce this, I always tell the food industry that they act as if they are in the energy business, because what they sell is calories. Energy is, making money by selling more calories to more people more often is not a business that's a model that's sustainable. And I would actually add that moving from quantity to quality actually doesn't just mean from calories to nutrition, but also from calories to pleasure. Because really, what the business needs to do in wealthy countries like ours, where people don't really eat for calories but for pleasure, is to realize that their business model right now, focusing on quantity, meaning large portions, is actually bad from a pleasure point of view. Because one thing we know is that pleasure in food doesn't come from quantity, but from quality and savoring. And so portion sizes, I think, are really one of the areas where there could be a win-win. Portions have grown incredibly. The consumers don't even realize they're not paying for them, but then they're eating it, and then it's, of course, waste that's just lose-lose for everyone. And just to finish on and jump on what Susan mentioned about end of vials, that actually was the intervention in our supermarkets with Carrefour and Auchan, which proved to be probably the most liked from everyone. The retailers loved it, the customers loved it. Hopefully the data will show that it was effective, but I'm pretty sure it will be. And we didn't even need to come up with a restriction to prevent it. It was something that naturally, there was a really big demand for healthier foods at checkout lines. So I think I am optimistic that there are win-win opportunities, not always, obviously, we can't be naive, but there are opportunities, especially if you're looking, like Susan said, not at food manufacturers who just sell one kind of product, but look at retailers, and also not forgetting food service companies like Sodexo, Compass Group, etc., the restaurant business, where they have two customers, the eaters, us, but also the companies. And some companies like Google, for example, understand that cafeteria is more than just food. It's a way where people connect, interact, get creative, and get healthy. And this helps these companies really offer higher quality food, better food.
Great, thank you. We have another question that's just come in, and I know that a number of you working in the CHL teams are thinking of this and working on it. Of course, this big rise and shift to digital and how people now have changed their habits moving to online. So maybe Hannah or Filippo, you could help me with this question. Is there a difference in the way we behave online or in the physical environment, and do you see any opportunities or challenges in this space for everyone listening today?
Thanks, Sharon. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question to explore, how behaviors differ in an online versus in a physical or offline environment. I think there is some evidence from behavioral sciences suggesting that there are different elements to how we tend to behave. So, for example, we tend to do fewer impulse shopping and purchases online. And that might partly be due to the way in which we interact with online shopping environments. So for example, we can use a search function to go straight to the products that we initially intended to purchase, rather than having to pass by many different supermarket aisles and potentially be tempted to purchase a product that we did not initially plan or intend to purchase. I think the second part of this question is the really interesting point. So what are the opportunities that an online shopping environments can generate? And many of the interventions that we talked about today and presented today are much more easy to implement in an online environment compared to physical stores. So if we think about swaps, for example, those pop-up windows that encourages you to switch from a product to a healthier version of it is much easier to implement online than in a physical store. You can think about filters, for example, so that somebody can set a filter only to see products of a certain nutritional value when they shop online. This is again something that you can only do online. Or providing real-time information about the nutritional composition of your overall basket. Again, really hard to implement offline, but potentially feasible in an online supermarket. And the third point perhaps to mention is the feasibility and ease of implementation. So obviously, even the easiest interventions to implement, like repositioning foods, can be actually quite challenging to implement offline in real physical stores, whereas it can be much more feasible to do those interventions online. I think a risk potentially is that we get carried away by these opportunities, that it's much easier and much more innovative to do things online. But the reality is that a great majority of people still do their purchases in physical stores. So it's important not to get too distracted by this opportunity and to make sure that we do both things. I think COVID certainly has increased the number of people who want to or have to do their shopping online. So this has certainly increased the rate, the scale of these interventions and the opportunity to reach a higher number of people. But still really important to also consider doing effective things in physical stores as well. And I'm not sure, Hannah, if you want to talk about the tool that we developed to facilitate evaluations in online food environment.
Yeah, maybe very briefly, because I think that is another interesting consideration that, you know, Filippo, you talked about the ease of implementation, but I think it similarly applies to sort of the ease of evaluation. And of course, there are sort of exactly the points that Susan mentioned around, you know, we still need to work out data sharing and setting all that, those kinds of things up. But still, evaluation can be, just in terms of the setup, in some circumstances, quite a bit easier in an online environment, just in terms of like the frequency, the ease of setting up experimental sort of conditions in that kind of environment, and also just the sort of wealth of data that you can collect as sort of outcome measures that you're looking at changing. One thing, and this is what Filippo was referring to, is that I think there's also then another sort of even lower risk version where you can do some pre-testing. So we've developed a tool that can, you know, you can essentially then do a sort of model online supermarket where you can then maybe test some of the sort of more tricky or maybe things that we're less sure about and putting out into the real world before putting that on the sort of live website as well. So I think that's, I guess, another sort of advantage of it gives you sort of a place to test out different things and also scale quite quickly.
Yeah, and we definitely across the different countries, there has been all of our initiatives in Latin America all moved fully online. So there's a lot of testing going on at the moment, and it is true that when you find something effective, you can move very quickly to scale. So that's something I think, follow us, and we'll be reaching back out to you with results on that. So we just have 2 minutes left. I had 2 comments more. This is more on the employee piece of the framework. So there's a comment on the struggle at Healthy Food at Work when you come to vending machines as your only option. And we've had questions by email on some work that had been done by a colleague in Spain, putting smiley faces in front of options, and people, when they were taking the one with the sad smiley face, the guilty feeling, and you both, Hannah and Filippo, you'd mentioned that, and that's, you know, not necessarily the technique you want to use. So, and I know, Pierre, you're doing some work with the out-of-home sector as well. Is there anything that you wanted to share around canteens or vending machines and driving choice in that space?
So I really believe that out-of-home should be a key, because we know that the amount of money that, forget COVID, of course, you know, but long term, that going into food prepared out-of-home is increasing. In the US, it's more than half. And out-of-home, we don't have the safeguards that you have in supermarkets. There's no information about nutritional value. Often there's no information about size. you don't even know how big the sandwich is or how big the cup is. And there are opportunities at the same time, because again, if you're a restaurant, you don't necessarily want to just sell cookies. There are lots of things you can sell. And I think it's a very promising area. And so I'm happy to be testing some of the same interventions now in restaurants. And vending machines, I think to me that's also another, it's a little bit more of a smaller scale probably. And so going back to what Filippo said, we need to be careful not to be carried away, I think, by technology. It's true that online it's fun, it's easy, we can measure, but it's still a tiny, tiny proportion of what people are ordering, except perhaps if we're looking at food delivery, which is of course becoming really big and is online. But really, if we want to go back to the basic of trying to have an impact at scale, we need to remember that where do most people get their food, and this is where we need to be. Even though it might not be the easiest, it might not be the place that's fanciest, it is where we should be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so. One quick reflection, which would be on the inequalities as well, right? So we need to be where the people are, but also where the people are that are sort of most affected by this.
Sharon, just one quick comment for me on vending machines. Vending machines, there's an awful lot of them about. And if they were all healthier, then that would be a big step in the right direction. It's a great place to think about this concept of availability. So ensure that actually the availability of the healthier options is very much greater than the less healthy options. That's partly for all the reasons we've already talked about in terms of changing the default. It also means quite frankly that the less healthy ones might run out a bit quicker, and that's just the way it goes. So you also get a bit of choice editing as well. But certainly there is simply no excuse in vending machines for not having more low or no calorie options than sugary versions. And you could apply similar principles when you come to snack foods as well.
Great, we've run out of time. Thank you so much. I know there's still some questions that have gotten by email. I promise I will come back to you. A huge thank you, Hannah, Susan, Pierre, and Filippo, for all of your expertise, and for everyone listening who's continuing to work with us to drive this ambition step by step, day by day, in your stores, online, and with your own people. We're immensely grateful. And we look forward to really sharing those learnings with everyone. And most of our studies and learnings are available on our global learning mechanism, which is globallearningmechanism.com. So thank you so much for your attention, and I'll follow up on all of the questions. Thank you.